in summary, I would say that the bill represents marginal gains that, for the reasons I'll explain, are likely to be implemented in a marginal fashion, particularly if you're an international business. We've already got the complexity that arose after leaving the European Union. I'm told we can't say too much about transfers, but I think that's a really fine example of where my team have seen a huge increase in the burdens imposed on them from changes. The BBC, I think, I'm almost going to take the position, we hear a lot of chatter about the bill from the perspective of business, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective of the data subjects. And the reason that I'm doing that is that one of the core values of the BBC is trust. And that's trust not just in relation to our programme content, which obviously is at the forefront of that value, but also the data that we collect when people are engaging with that content, and then how we use that information, particularly if we're using that to inform future content, personalisation, that kind of thing. So for me, trust is a key lens that certainly the BBC will be looking at these changes through. Just because you can now do something that you didn't that you now no longer need to do something that previously you were required to do, doesn't mean that that's the right thing to do, particularly if you are looking through the lens of trust. There are some of the changes that I think start to create a bit of tension around trust. And I don't hear enough noise about that. I completely agree with John that for SMEs who are UK-based, this is generally good news, unless you've got a product or a service where trust is absolutely centre stage. Because even then, you might actually decide that some of these changes are not things that you want to implement. But if you're an international business, for me, the worst thing that could happen on this divergence journey, and I think we're on a journey, we haven't got to the end of this journey yet, would be divergence where we could no longer apply a common denominator approach to compliance. That will be a disaster. And what I mean by that is where us applying the highest privacy standard is no longer compliant in certain jurisdictions, and particularly if you're doing that comparison between the EU and the UK. Now, I'm not suggesting that the bill contains those problems, but we've already got this issue around transfers. You know, you can complying with the EU requirement does not mean that you're transparent with the UK requirement. So that is an issue for us. I think from my perspective, we would want to ensure that for each of these changes, that change is the right thing for the BBC. So what am I really focusing on in terms of changes that worry me a little bit? I think some of the changes to DPIAs and ROPAs, I'm a little bit surprised that ROPAs and DPIAs are characterised as bureaucratic and burdensome, when for me they're the building blocks of a compliance framework within an organisation. How can you possibly start to comply with even a slightly diluted framework if you don't know where your data is, if you don't know what your data is being used for? So I do think there's a bit of a mischaracterisation of some of these changes. And, you know, as John was saying, I certainly think from our perspective, we are very likely to maintain what we're currently doing, even if we're not required to do so when the law changes.